weighing of the soul in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Its Greek name was psychostasia, which means the state of the balance of the psyche. And we'll just get that. Yeah. We saw the image from the Egyptian Book of the Dead of the weighing of the soul. The scales, which is like a very interesting tool, implement. The scales that weigh the soul are from a technological advance having to do with metals, with metallurgy. That balance is an assayer's balance to test for purity. And it was not so much that the purity was supposed to be originally a metaphor for the spirit, but the purity was to be the metal itself having been completely extracted from the ore. It's important to understand that the original basis upon which the later metaphors for spiritual purity were not so much the spiritual purity in terms of weeding out the false cleverness, but it was in reference to the completion of the process of distillation, of taking the gold out of the ore completely. It was only later that the issue became one of craftiness, that yes, the ore, the gold, was taken completely out of the ore, but then someone would water down the gold after the distillation process was complete. So there are two different aspects to deception. The first was a natural occurrence, which was not technically a deception, but it was the incomplete process of extraction. The second is a true deception, where the gold that was taken out of the ore, even though the process of extraction and distillation was complete, the gold would be watered down by the introduction of extraneous metal, cheaper metal, that would usually, they would use at that time something like tin, because if you used copper, it would color the gold. And so we need to understand that in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which goes back 5,000 years, that already this is a very sophisticated level. Even though the Egyptian Book of the Dead and the recension that this illustration comes from is the Theban recension, not the Heliopolis, but the Theban recension, 19th dynasty, about 2000 BC. The original coming from about 3000 BC. But even at 3000 BC, it was not the original metallurgical concern of complete extraction. That goes back to about 7 to 8,000 BC. So that the Egyptian Book of the Dead as we have it, even though it's very ancient to us, actually comes about midway in the whole career of metallurgical technology development. In the first half of that development, from say roughly 8,000 BC to about 3,000 BC, the concern was to make sure that the extraction process was completed, so that the mythologies of that era were concerned with completion. Whereas the second half, the concern was with the deviousness of the watering down of the gold. Yes, it was completely extracted, but it's been tampered with. And so the mythologies of that later period are concerned not with completion but with perfection. So that all of the times that we know as civilization, this spiritual concern has been with perfection, but perfection assuming that completion had already been achieved. So when we're talking about a really sophisticated, complete education, such as we're involved with, we have to know, and it's not just being intellectual. There's no such thing as being an intellectual about this. One simply has to know, because this is what has gone on. And the larger patterns of language and of human action, the larger shapes of them, implicitly carry with them the lessons learned over those long millennia. And there's no way that we can even use language or even understand what it is that we're doing unless we're at least cursorily informed about how all of this came about. So we're concerned not with intellectualizing, we're concerned with wisdom, with understanding and appreciating. Now, in our education, we're concerned at this particular time with myth. Our concern with myth has come out of a previous concern which we had with ritual. And it isn't just the turn of the 20th century emphasis that people at the University of Cambridge around Sir James George Fraser and Jane Ellen Harrison, who said that myth and ritual are linked together. It isn't just that kind of a school of thought of mythology, exemplified by later the developments in anthropology by Malinowski, or the developments by Jessie Weston in her discussion of, say, from ritual to romance, how the Grail issues became tarot deck issues, and all of them go back to an even earlier time, all based upon ritual procedures. It isn't just that. It's of a much more profound scope. The scope is simply this. Myth has to do with experience. It has to do with feeling. The intelligence of feeling. Myths are about the intelligence of feeling. That the sensitivity of feeling is very refined and expresses itself in a language, and that language is mythic. That feeling needs to, loves to, wants to tell the story of anything and everything, how it began, what complications developed, and where it went. Beginning, a middle, and an end. The very form of this motion of talking about something begins twice. And unless one knows that it begins twice, you lose the wisdom of pairing. And so we have to look that at a genesis point, we know from modern chaos theory, that whatever complications, whatever complexity happens because of a universal process of bifurcation starting from a single generator, a genesis point. There are diagrams in books now of fractal chaos theory and high dynamic systems that show classically that there is an original single bifurcation, and that very rapidly that becomes a complexity which is no longer able to be followed by the ordinary discursive mind, by the ordinary sense of feeling. So that as quick as that, feeling is outstripped by complexity once the bifurcation process takes place. myth is unable to resolve finer than the fact that a double creation has happened. It's still indelibly there, for instance, in the book of Genesis. There are two creations. There are two creations, and there are two creations of man. And unless one knows this, one goes completely astray trying to follow a single line, because all geometries are made out of the developments of a single line. And if you do not know that that line is actually a parallel double line, a paired parallel double line, one then does not have the true sense that the geometry that one is trying to understand is actually a very complex. It has more dimensions than simply what geometry would have. Geometry's complexity is limited to a plane. As long as you have a three-dimensional plane, you have a geometry and you can follow the complexity of a single line of development. But when there are two lines of developments, when there are paired parallel lines of developments, you have to bring a fourth dimension into play, and you have to transform the plane into a sphere. And by doing so, you transform geometry into trigonometry. And when you have a trigonometry, then you have to pay attention to functions. Then you have to pay attention to energy sine waves and the way in which complementation always happens. And it happens in a double way. It happens to affect completeness, and it happens to affect, in the second place, perfection. So that when one is learning to understand experience in a really mature way, we have to understand that there's not only a geometry of experience, which is there in the kind of basic myth structure, but there's also a trigonometry of feeling, which is there in the spherical wholeness of a mythology. And so in order to refine experience, we have to understand not only the plane on which myths take place, but we have to understand the sphere in which a mythology is real. And both of them are linked together. And both of them have the same starting point. But both startings occur at the same point at different times. One follows the other. So that there's a phase differential. A slight phase differential between the quest for perfection and the quest for completeness. And it's this slight differential, slight when it begins, but it's like a widening angle. And the more that a mythic line develops, the more that a mythology has its resonant sphere, the more apparent it becomes that that slight differential is the trigger for a reversal that does not happen in nature. The reversal is that growth, instead of just always going outward, recursively, I have to use a mathematical term, it recursively begins to go inward. The slight differential in between the lines that develop completeness and the line that develops perfection is the trigger motive for symbols to become operative in an interior world. There would be no interior world if they were exactly parallel. There would be only a paradox of a quivering surface which could neither interiorize nor could go any further out. But because they are not exactly parallel, because there's a slight difference, the interior world develops in a complementation to the exterior development. To put it succinctly in universal language, self and cosmos are related together. And as the self focuses, the cosmos differentiates. And when one has precisely who one is, when you reach your soul center, the universe is cosmically whole. Perfection and wholeness are linked together. But if one talks about it in this way, if one skips all of this development that we're going through, you come up with the sense of some kind of a metaphysic that doesn't do anyone any good. It's not that there aren't metaphysics, of course there are. But they don't do anyone any good. Why? Because unfortunately we live at a time when all the myths and all the metaphysics are over. Why are they over? Because they happen within a certain development. And that development has reached a fullness and is finished. And there needs to be a new development. Something else. And what it is hasn't occurred yet. So we live in peculiar lifetimes where the old, which was perfectly true, and as a matter of fact in high wisdom traditions understood so well that it could be characterized exactly, doesn't do us any good. That's a house we have left. And the new house that we're coming to is not yet built. And so we're camped out on the front yard of Mr. Blanding's dream house. And the architect keeps saying, well, are you sure you want these things? Yes, we do. Oh, we want this new world. We want to have all these new capacities. Are you sure it's going to cost? What is it going to cost? It's going to cost you in consciousness. And meanwhile, we're running up a tremendous bill of a new house, which is all fine and well, but we still daydream and think we're living in the old house. And that old house is gone. It's gone forever. Somebody asked Jesus someplace about the old gods, and he said they were dead. And it's foolish to keep on piling goodies on the altar of dead gods. They're gone. So we have to remain camped in front of the new place and run up this bill. And this kind of education is meant to be able to give us the cash reserves psychically so we can pay and have that new house. We're going to buy it with cash. No time payments. We don't like the creditors in this crummy universe. They phone our psyches every day. Where's our payment? Sorry. What does all this have to do with Innana? Innana, right now, the Sumerian queen of heaven, her mythology is paired for us with Plato's Phaedrus. We learn to take, instead of a single book, a pair of books. We're using a methodology consistently throughout our education. And that methodology is like, instead of taking a single book, which one would then use as an authority, as a single rod, like some Bible-beating fundamentalist, or some Quran-beating fundamentalist, or some Torah-beating fundamentalist. All brothers of the book. Believe or die. Whereas if you take two books, you turn the book out of its rod-like sternness into a calipers, which you can now create your circles of wholeness and learn the geometry of completion and intuit the trigonometry of perfection. It's a simple trick, and it is a trick. But when you're dealing with the demons that there are, every trick is useful and it helps if it works. So that the ancient Sumerian god of the masculine father mode his name was Enki. He was the crafty god. He never won battles by being a warrior, a Taoist warrior, Zen warrior, some kind of a Putzpa Sanjuro. He was not. But Enki was crafty. And in fact, the most recent study of Enki by the great Sumerian scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, Myths of Enki, the Crafty God, published by Oxford University Press just a few years ago. Samuel Noah Kramer is the great specialist in Sumerian studies. He's the one who has made Sumeria available. He's the one who got Diane Volkstein to make her translation of the myths of Innana, because she's very good. She's very capable. The crafty god does not fight battles as a warrior. He survives tests as a cunning and magical masculine being. But because he's cunning, because he's magical, he's not the mate to Innana, but is her father. And so the father-daughter pair are an archetypal pair which gather around the sense of the man teaching the woman cunning and magic, so that she can make her own tests and survive her own tests. Tests given to her and tests which she gives to others. And so Innana is extremely important because she is the daughter who gathers the powers of the crafty and cunning and magical father. She's not a warrior goddess. She is the goddess of cunning and magic, of craft. Craft, for craft you can read technology, techne, which means that all the developments of technological civilization, of being clever about nature, not just being brute powerful about nature, but clever. How are you clever about nature? You're clever about nature because instead of beating your fist against it, you learn about its structure and you deal with it structurally. When one deals with the structure of things, then they're able to be transformed, to be reassembled. And so in Enki, Innana is the divine relationship of how a man passes on to a woman, a father passes on to a daughter, the way to handle structure so that you can restructure what is into something more useful for you, even though it was not originally. But one has to watch out, because why? There are two sets of process that you have to be concerned with. One is the process of getting your materials pure, completing the extraction process, and secondly, of keeping those materials pure, the concern with perfection. And so this is a very complex issue, and it's extremely meaningful for the way in which men and women have evolved in social structures larger than club-wielding tribes. None of these issues came up as long as people were in Flintstones era. But as soon as one takes a step beyond that, as soon as a culture develops to an extent where it begins to have feeling, intelligence, operative in its daily flow, and myths are told, essentially, to keep the cultural structure together, then you have to have this. Then this comes out. In fact, in Kramer's book, Chapter 3 is entitled Enki and Innana, the Organization of the Earth and its Cultural Processes. And of course, one of the first concerns, one of the first technologies that calls for the organization of the earth and its attendant cultural process is the development of agriculture. The Flintstone level, you just pick the berries. As soon as you go beyond that, you grow the kind of berries you want and harvest them in enough quantities that they can see you through till the next season. So the development of metallurgy and the development of agriculture braid together. And that these myths about Innana are all about the way in which there is a massive transfer from a celestial father who is very crafty and yet very potent in magic and cunning about the structure of things to the daughter who is here in this life, in this world, and is able to bring those powers and those capacities to bear for man in this world. Enki is not much concerned with man. Innana loves man. She's our lady. She's our heavenly lady who's able to be here for us. She brings these goods and goodies, these processes. They're called in Sumerian, oddly enough, the phonetic word is me, me. She brings the divine me here so that we have a me which is operative in a wider world. Not only a wider world in terms of an extended plane, but an enriched world in the sense of having a whole sphere of capacity, of mobility, which we did not have before. But in order to maintain it, in order to keep it, in order to have it, we have to also learn, like Innana learned from her father, we have to learn from Innana how to complete it and how to perfect it and keep these things in balance. And the whole intelligence about feeling is that when things are in balance, when the completion and perfection processes are operating together with a slight differential, we feel all right. When any one of three things goes wrong, we start to feel things are not right. When the completion process isn't really getting completed, we get a little antsy. And when the perfection process is not really pure, we get a little frenetic. And when something even more subtle, the third thing, the differential between the two, is smeared so that it appears that both are exactly equal, we get tremendously neurotic because this is absolutely wrong. It's not right. Then culture is living in a Nazi-type faction instead of in a wholeness and growth faction. So these myths of Innana, even though they take place originally at the very beginnings of a cultural transformation, this cultural transformation happened about 4,000 years ago. That is to say, about 2000 BC. 2,000 years before the Common Era. What was happening then was what happened, say, about 2,000 years ago, and what is happening now. The ancient word that the Greek language used for this was aion, A-I-O-N. You may have seen this word in some of Carl Jung's writings. One of the collected works of Carl Jung, Volume 9, Part 1, is called Aion. Its subtitle is Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. And the second part of Volume 9, in the collected works of Jung, appropriately is concerned with archetypes. Archetypes in the unconscious. Now, we don't have to raise the issues of the unconscious. It's somewhat of a beggared term anyway. It's an idea that needs to be inspected with care and is very misleading. Actually, it generates false metaphysics much more rapidly than almost any other word in use in the English language today. I prefer not to use the term unconscious, although I know what it means. I prefer to be unconscious about the unconscious, like Harpo Marx, and keep on trucking. What's important for us is to realize that this kind of concern that we have is about something very profound that once actually happened and now has to be gone through by any culture or any civilization that hopes to go someplace new. We can only go someplace new. We can only take a new step when we have fulfilled all of the old steps first. After conception, when the embryo in the womb is going through its growth, it goes through all the phases that life has gone through up to the human. Goes through the fish phase, goes through all kinds of phases. So that when that embryo is born and becomes a baby, it comes out as a human baby. And then has to go through all the growth phases that evolution has still gone through, all the phases of the development of societal relationalities. You have to crawl before you can walk, before you can run, before you can jump on a Luke Skywalker speeder and hit it. All of these phases have to be gone through, and there's a universal wisdom principle involved here. You cannot take a new step until you have completed fully all of the previous steps. And you cannot take a new step right unless you have perfected all of the previous stages. So completion, and then perfection. If and then. If it's completed, and then perfected, then you can take the new step. Until that's done, until that's happened, one can only imagine that you're taking a new step. One can only fantasize about what it will be like to take a new step. And currently we live in a society that is buried in fantasies about the cosmos, about space travel, because no one has taken one single step since, what was it, Apollo 16? When Harrison Schmitt climbed back into the lunar module. That last step is where we left off, and there isn't anything going to happen until one steps from there forward. And it doesn't matter how many flying saucers. It doesn't matter how UFO they are. No alien can transgress a universal law. It goes against the prime directive, kiddies. You can't help man take one goddamn step farther than Harrison Schmitt's last footprint into the cosmos until all these other stages and steps are fulfilled. And what this education is about is just getting up to speed to where you can step off on your own, wherever you want to go. Because by now, man has earned the right to be free in the universe. And you should claim that right, that privilege, because it belongs to you. It is yours. Chapter 3, in Myths of Enki, the Crafty God, Samuel Noah Kramer, Oxford, 1989. Enki and Innana, chapter 4, reverses it. Innana and Enki. Now notice we used to do that here with the tape titles for this course. We would have something like we began. We began with I Ching and Thoreau, and the second lecture turned it around, Thoreau and I Ching. The I Ching was a way of completing a process. Thoreau is the way of perfecting a process. Parallel to, paired with the I Ching, but slightly different. The I Ching is all about, as we saw at the very beginning of our course, is about the completeness of the natural realm. And Thoreau is about the perfection of the observer of that completeness in the natural realm. The I Ching we saw was based upon the Taoist mythic phase of a thunderstorm in the mountains. The 8 trigrams that make up the 64 hexagrams, each of the natural images of the 8 trigrams follow in a sequence which is actually a myth, a primordial Chinese myth from about the same time as Sumeria, about 3,000, 3,500 BC, about how there is lightning and thunder, and then the rain comes down, and the rain collects in the pools. In the pools, one can see the reflection of mountains, so that one looks up and beholds and senses the earth. And sensing the earth, one is able to look back up and see the starry expanses beyond the thunderheads. And so this whole ecology, and then the thunderheads put the rain again. So the I Ching is all based upon a cycle of completeness of nature. And Thoreau is about the center of that cycle of completeness in nature. It's about someone who is able to stand at the center of the cycle of the completeness of nature and know it. And by knowing it, perfect the cycle. Because the perfection is always the center of the completeness. Thoreau wrote in his journal in September of 1840 about how the world, when you look with accurate eyes in a forest, is equally balanced between sunlight and shadow. That when trees naturally grow together in a natural setting, in a forest, there are equal amounts of sunlight and shadow. They're perfectly balanced. He saw with those yin-yang Taoist eyes. He went back to that forest in a time of deep winter in order to stand with the trees in a snowstorm, because he said no one had ever done that before. And standing in the center of the forest in the winter, observing the snowstorm, he became a surveyor of the way in which the equidistant light and shadow holds itself even in a winter snowstorm, just like in an autumn sunlight afternoon. Very mystical kind of quality. And from this, Thoreau perfected, as much as any yogi has ever done, perfected the way in which someone stands at the center of the cycle of nature and through pure realization perfects it. We still think of him as a quaint American figure because we tend to write off American genius. But the rest of the world, people like Gandhi and so forth, read Thoreau as yogic masters of how you deal with life now effectively. We started the education with I Ching and Thoreau, and then reversed it Thoreau and I Ching. Samuel Noah Kramer uses here Enki and Innana, chapter 3, and then reverses it, Innana and Enki. Enki and Innana was about the organization of the earth and its cultural processes. Innana and Enki is about the transfer of the arts of civilization. The transfer. The father no longer leading, the daughter now leading. It was father-daughter, now it's daughter-father. The one was about the organization of the earth and the origins of culture, complemented by the transformation of the arts of civilization, by transferring it from where the father was to where the daughter is. And in terms of culture, it's very important for a woman to be able to leave her father's house and begin a house of her own. to take the father's capability and put it in her own house. And as we will see, this is a fundamental process. It is not just the process of the father passing on to the son. That's a single line. That's only a plane dimension. It doesn't have any trigonometry in it. And if pushed to an extreme with all kinds of power, it turns out to be a Nazi Germany or a Stalinist Soviet Union or a Caesar's Rome. It turns out to be a masculine one-sidedness which is perilous, especially to all the other feminine values. And that those feminine values happen to be the values that take from completion the sense that there is an interior which can achieve perfection. And without that balance, a man is convinced that if he only can get enough power and organize it far enough, there will be no more enemies. Faulkner said once in his Nobel Prize speech that if left to his ingeniousness, unmitigated man will soon turn the planet into one huge paved featureless ball, so that there will be no protuberances to endanger him whatsoever. There will be no intersections at which he could be threatened, and he will at last have free rein to go where he wants to go, on a completely paved ball. Fortunately, he said, there will be still one thing bedeviling man, and that is his inexhaustible voice, starting to tell himself stories again about what-ifs that haven't happened or didn't happen, and by those kinds of complications, man is saved. Because even in his moment of complete triumph, man will begin to wonder if there isn't something else. And who does he turn to ask but the nearest woman he can find? Well, what do you think about that? And she'll say, of course, it's lousy. Let's take a break and let's come back. Let's come back and let's hold our tone. You know, when you train a wild horse, the only thing that you need to do to begin with is to tether that horse. You put a single rope around the horse and you tie the other end to a stake or a corral post, whatever. And the random motions of the wild horse become self-tutoring for the horse to calm because there's a tether there. And it's the beginning of the process of domesticating the horse. The same thing with the mind. A yogi throws a single tether and just lets the mind go wherever it will. It'll take a long vacation because we have a very creative mind. And after 30 or 40 years, the mind organizes itself because of this kind of interiorization that happens. It's very peculiar that this should be so. It's a universal process, actually. This education takes only 2 years. It's a shortcut. It's a jet. It's like Vajrayana of education. You don't have to take 30 or 40 years. 2. But you have to take 2. These 2 processes we were talking about earlier, before the break, completion and perfection. They're perennial issues. And in the complement to Innana, the myths of Innana, Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus, these 2, completeness and perfection, are addressed by Plato through the vehicle, the tether of Socrates. Socrates is the tether in Plato's dialogues. Well, Socrates is the one who patiently chats with us in a methodological procedure of inquiry, which is the way in which philosophy develops. Philosophy is this line of inquiry that develops. Philosophy is a masculine line of inquiry that develops. And if you have someone like a Socrates, whose teacher was not a man but a woman, Diotima, he has wisdom along with philosophy. So that along with the developing line of masculine philosophy, there is the paired line of feminine perfection wisdom that comes at the same pace but just a little behind. Phase formed so that the one arrives just before the other. The old 1-2 punch. The concern which a masculine sensibility will have with completeness is that it look good. His concern is eventually an aesthetic concern. And when the aesthetic concern is raised to a really sublime level, it becomes a concern with beauty. So that the beautiful is a masculine sense of carrying through completion exactly. I saw a film once on the great Mexican artist, Siqueiros. Siqueiros with his little top hat and his little cigar. And he was completing this great work of art, which was a building was built specifically for it. The work was called The March of Humanity in Latin America. And it was both a mural and a sculpture at the same time in a building built exactly for them, sort of a Wagnerian type ultimate art production. And when in filming this they were finished with it, Siqueiros stood there and the camera caught him with his little cigar and his little top hat and a little puff of smoke, and he said one word, perfecto. Tossed away his cigar and walked away. That's it. A man is satisfied when he says, that's beautiful. When Signor Ferrari turned out his first automobile, you can tell what he said. Not that we're going to make money, but that the thing is beautiful. Look at that. So a man is concerned with the aesthetics of completeness, with getting it done right. And there's a satisfaction, that was done right. But right behind it, underneath it, like the finer line. You know, when you're cooking spaghetti, you have to make sure that you cook it all the way through, otherwise there's a little brittle core that is uncooked in the spaghetti. It doesn't work. The perfection has to be that little core that's cooked all the way through. You have to have completeness cooked completely so that it's also perfect. So that not only is it done right, but that it nourishes you. You can eat it. What's the interior? The perfection interior of beauty. The beautiful. It's love. It's love. And so Socrates in the Phaedrus talks about how beauty is made, but love as a spirit has to be invited to take up residence in that beautiful, in that beauty. Because without the spirit of love, the beautiful is not perfect. Yes, it is complete. It's done right. Doesn't live. It doesn't have a soul. And love is the soul of the sublimely beautiful. So that a work of art, when it is finished, it is aesthetically finished, but it also has to move you. It has to carry that transmissible center to you and awaken your center. Then you got the transmission. All of the powers of Enki, the father god, stupendous list of powers, it's in the myth of Innana. But they have to come to her, and she is the interior perfecting of this. And when that's awakened, then she has it and can give it to us. Because Enki, the father god, is not going to share his goods with man. The father god, in ancient understanding, is not going to give his power up. And in fact, in Innana, she has to get him drunk on beer. Yeah, beer. Oh boy. We're going to pass by where she leans against the apple tree, and her vulva was wondrous to behold. You better buy this book. Innana and Enki. He has it. She has it here. Enki and Innana. They're still at that stage. Drank beer together. The next line, they drank more beer together. The third line, they drank more and more beer together. And because he's a good dad, right? And he's in his cups, he says, I'm gonna make a present to you of all this stuff. You're gonna have this. And she says, I'll take it. And then he has more stuff, right? He's proud dad. Look at all this stuff. Take it. I take it. And pretty soon, her barge is loaded with all of his goods. What kind of goods are they? It's masterful. Everything that you could imagine. He gave me the noble scepter, the high throne, the shepherdship, the princess priestess, the incantation priest, the descent into the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the beautiful garments, the loosening of the hair, the art of kissing the phallus, the art of prostitution, the art of adorning speech, the art of slanderous speech, the art of forthright speech, many, many things. The rejoicing of the heart, the secure dwelling place, the craft of the builder. He also gave her fear, dismay, consternation, the kindling of fire, procreation, the making of decisions, the giving of judgments. All of the capacities of the Father God were given to the daughter. And what does she want with them? She wants to take them to her city and give them to her people. He would never share them with people. In his city, the first city, Eridu, the very first city of Samaria, we know from archaeology that Catalhuyuk was a going city 3,000 or 4,000 years before Eridu. But to the Sumerians, Eridu was the first city. It's the Jerusalem of Sumerian culture. It's the place. It's the place where the Father God holds sway. And in his temple are all these gifts, but they stay in the temple. Only the priests that come into the temple under certain circumstances can get the loan of a gift here or there. You better bring it back and bring it back intact. But with Innana, it's a completely different thing. She wants these gifts to take them to her city, Uruk. Because when they're in Uruk, they're going to belong to all people. She's that kind of divinity. She shares what she has. She has the cornucopia of good things. She has the bouquet of all of the qualities that make human life interesting, without which it's not interesting. Without which the best that happens is that you get to club tonight's dinner after an all-day chase. That's not very interesting. After 70 or 80 generations of clubbing tonight's meal after an all-day chase, even the stoutest of hunters ask, isn't there a better way? Can't Gelsons come in here and do something about this? What's wrong with pre-packaged rhino or something? So the whole motive is that there needs to be a sharing of all of these gifts and capacities. They cannot remain sequestered in the father's power, but they have to come to the daughter, because it's through the daughter that they're shared with man. By how is this? How does this happen? Because the daughter interiorizes the values, and by making them interior, is able to pass them out through resonances. How does Plato have Socrates, the philosophic tether, deliver this in the Phaedrus? 278a. That is paragraph 278a. All of Plato's paragraphs and all of the dialogues are numbered, because after 2,400 years, people have been still reading this and still referring to them and saying, well, you know, actually, he's not as old-fashioned as we thought when we were younger, contentious philosophers. Now that we're kind of experienced in the world and realize there are lots of ifs, ands, and buts about things, Plato is worth reading. Socrates is talking about writing. He's talking about how a written language is different from an oral language. An oral language is an exteriorization of language. A written language is an interiorization of language. The interiorizing by language is the way in which this world is transformed from out there to in here. And feeling, experience, is the transformational medium. Socrates says to Phaedrus, they're having this conversation not in Athens, but outside of town. It's the only philosophic dialogue by Plato that takes place outside the city, along a little stream, a beautiful place, he says. He says, the true sacred language is written not on paper so much, but written on the heart of the hearer. Come again? Written on the heart of the hearer. Now this was an extremely profound idea. And when Plato wrote it down, when he brought it into play in the dialogue of the Phaedrus, it was around 390 BC. It was already an idea that had been mooted for several centuries. Mooted by Pythagoras in Greece, first of all, but mooted before Pythagoras, and the first time that it's ever written down is actually in the Old Testament. I mean, I hate to tell you, but it is. In the book of Jeremiah. I think it's the 44th chapter of Jeremiah. Where Jeremiah, who has been taken captive into an exile. Not the first exile. The first exile was the Neo-Babylonians coming and taking the cream of the Jewish men and women to run the Neo-Babylonian empire. They were taken to Persia. But in order to get away from that, many of the clever and brightest men and women took their prize prophet Jeremiah and fled into Egypt. Well, they're not going to get us. We're not going to be taken into exile. But instead of being taken into the exile with a capital E in Persia, they took themselves into an exile with a small e into Egypt. And Jeremiah, who was held captive there against his will, he said, this whole exile business is God's doing. You can't interfere with this. And that's when he said, since you've interfered with this, he said, the old covenant is broken. it's finished. And there needs to be a new covenant, no longer written on stone tablets, but written on the hearts and minds of the hearers. Exactly the words that are here in Plato's Phaedrus. Exactly. Not saying that Plato read Jeremiah. I doubt it sincerely. But Plato was in the wisdom current of his time, which understood very much what Jeremiah had said. That is, when a certain level of fullness happens, that man begins to overflow from the kinds of covenants that can be written on stone, then he is entered into a new, more complex trigonometric relationship with nature, and he has to have those covenants written on his heart and mind, because only then will he respect them. Because he's become good and clever at manipulating the world in sub-clause contracts of the written covenants on the stones. We're going to make a little adjustment here. It says this, but it means such and so. And so one has to get off the plane of the stone tablets and into the sphere, the interior sphere of the heart and mind. There you can have a covenant that's now written in a new language. It's this language that Socrates is talking about, just like Jeremiah. He's talking about it to Phaedrus. He's saying Phaedrus. When Thoth, the ancient Egyptian scribe, first invented sacred language, Hieros Logos, is how it was said in Greek. Hieros Logos. Yeats called it high talk. The high talk of the spirit. It lifts man's vision from just the stereoptic looking at this world, because the two eyes, in order to see anything, notice how anything in this world, you have to focus your two eyes on its singularity. Otherwise you can't see it. If you try to interiorize this method of seeing, you use imagination and you recreate this physical seeing in your mind, but that's not really using your mind. That's just using the mind as a reproduction of the exterior vision. And so if I have an image of this rose petal in my mind, I'm just paralleling. But to see in terms of the mind itself does not see like exterior eyes see. When the mind itself sees, it sees in terms of wholeness, not in terms of singularity, but in terms of universality. And so one has to unlearn what would have been just a simple reproduction and stagger it a little bit, make the differential a little bit, so you get into the trigonometry of the sphere of the mind, because when the mind then looks, it doesn't just see this object, but it sees the significance, the spherical significance, that a single rose petal, for instance, is edible. You can eat them. You can perfume your mouth and your breath, and you can symbolically say that the words that one now speaks come directly from the inspiration of the rose. This is I think they use the term today, quantum jump. This is a quantum jump in the ability to have meaning. This is what it's all about. That myth was the interiorization process of language, by which man moved away from the ritual objective level to the symbolic interior objective level. You can do a lot objectively in an exterior way by rituals, but you can do an infinite number of times more by having symbolic objective realities. One idea is so powerful that it can index the entire world in ritual action. And we will learn later on next year that in the differential mode, quite different from the integration mode, all that we're talking about now is just one mode, integration, that in the differential realm, which is ever so much larger than the integral realm, where something objective like the spiritual person actually exists, one spiritual person can index all the symbols that ever were in the universe. Much more powerful. Much more real. But first we have to crawl. Socrates says to Phaedrus, written on the soul of the hearer, and to enable him to learn about the right, the beautiful, and the good. The right, in terms of what you do, the beautiful, in terms of its completeness, and the good, in terms of its perfection. So you can see, once somebody talks real language for a while, you can come to any classic heritage of man and you can lift it off its page and understand what's being said. Then it's significant. Then it's no longer just a book of intellectual stuff. Then it's food for life. One can live better if one knows this. Because anyone is going to then choose to enrich this kind of world. Why wouldn't you? It's our world. We actually live there. And to know that we can enrich our world, that's important. We're talking about Innana in Plato, and we've been doing that this is the 4th week. We're using this pair of books as a calipers to draw our circles, to get a cross-section of the spheres of feeling. Next week we're going to start with another pair of books. We're going to have another caliper. We're going to set this caliper down. We're going to take up another one. We're going to take up the book of Daniel, which is not just Old Testament stuff. It's not stuffy stuff. Take up the book of Daniel. It's the best book of dream analysis in the ancient world. It's the best book that handled dream analysis to a level where one could become sophisticated enough to move up to be able to analyze not only dreams that you would have, but dreams that someone else would have. Even dreams that someone else would have that they didn't tell you what the dream was. Can you imagine that? And not only dreams that someone else had that they didn't even tell you what the dream was, but waking dreams that are called visions. And not only waking dreams that are called visions, but those once in an aeon visions of the wholeness of the cosmos. The book of Daniel is about learning how to analyze on all 4 of these levels. And it was a workbook, written by one of the great geniuses of the ancient world. No one really knows his name. He's called the teacher of righteousness, for good reason. And he founded the Qumran Essene community on the Dead Sea. He also wrote the book of Job. He also wrote the Thanksgiving hymns that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the really great figures in world history. And we're going to take his book of Daniel, written about 160 BC, and pair it up with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, written about Chaucer's time. One of the most sophisticated of all the stories about love in world literature. The book of Daniel is about dream and vision analysis, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is about the finer points of interior chivalric recognition of the rules of love. So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is going to be a resonant development of the myths of Innana, and the book of Daniel is going to be a resonant enlarging of the Phaedrus of Plato. We're still using these calipers, but now we're going to use an electric version of these calipers. Because we can do a lot more with them. Let's come back to Innana just for a little bit. We haven't talked that much about Innana. Diane Volkstein, thankfully to her credit, paying attention to Samuel Noah Kramer, who's a really wise man, saw that one cannot just tell a myth of Innana. That, in fact, there's a set, S-E-T, there's a set, not just a collection, but there's a formal set of 5 myths of Innana that fit together in a certain development that we would call a phase form fullness. And that 5 phase fullness form we've seen before. We saw it at the very beginning of our course when we talked about the I Ching. That the I Ching operates not by yin-yang. The yin-yang is a structure, but that structure is in movement by something else called a 5-phase energy cycle. The yin-yang is like a calipers. It's like a tool. It's there. It's a universal principle that happens to operate all the time, everywhere, but how it operates is different from the tool. The operation of the tool is a function of its usage, and the function of its usage is the 5-phase energy cycle. The first phase of which is Tao. The second phase of which is Te. So when Lao Tzu talks about using the calipers of yin-yang wholeness, he talks about Tao Te Ching, the book of the Tao Te, and assumes that when you learn the one and the other, you will learn the other 3 also. He didn't develop the other 3 specifically in the Tao Te Ching, and so when Confucius came along about 2 generations after Lao Tzu, he assumed that everybody already knew about Tao and Te, and so Confucius begins with the 3rd, Zhen, human-heartedness. And so the Analects of Confucius are a continuation of the Tao Te Ching. The Tao Te Ching is about the first 2 phases of the energy cycle. The Analects of Confucius about the 3rd, about Zhen. The other 2 phases, Li is the 5th phase, which is ritual, principle. And the 4th phase was Yi, about symbols. And there are Confucian classics that deal with them. Largely, the person who followed Confucius, philosophically, his name was Mencius. Mengzi. There's a beautiful book written by I.A. Richards, an English literary critic on Mencius. The subtitle was Multiple Definitions of the Mind. It's a beautiful way to talk about symbols. So that Chinese wisdom is much different than the kind of, ground pablum that's dished out to foolish children by idiots in universities. Makes a lot of friends, I know. But if they had done their work right, they wouldn't have incurred the bill. The 5-phase energy cycle in Innana is the same as the 5-phase energy cycle in the I Ching. It's not surprising. Fu Shi, who is the originator of the I Ching, lived about 3000 BC, about the same time as the high wisdom tradition out of which the myths of Innana came. And the interplay between Sumeria and China at that time was the interplay from that creative interface out of which came the whole development later on of the high civilizations of India and Iran, that Central Asian Scythian era. The 5-phase cycle in Innana are the 5 myths that are arranged in a phase form, so that when that form is made complete, it becomes the mythology of Innana. Not just the myths of Innana, but altogether the 5 constitute the sphere or the mythology of Innana. And once one has the mythology of Innana, the full sphere of it, it's a matter of distilling by wisdom, by interiorization, by telling the mythology again and again so that one gets it so completely that one can begin to interiorize its meaning and find the center. And at the very center is the complement to Innana. The very fulcrum of the mythology of Innana, which concerns Innana, the hidden underground interior center, is her sister, Arishkigal, who is the queen of the underworld. Innana is the queen of the upper world. And her complement, her pair, her sister, is the queen of the underworld, only to be found if one can go inside of the world, which is the sphere of Innana's mythology, and make the descent in the underworld to its center. And the person who must do that most of all is Innana herself. She must be able to go to the center of her own interior sphere once it's generated. And in order to go there, she must divest herself of 7 symbols of her royal divine capacity, so that she denudes herself progressively as she goes through her descent. And when all 7 veils are taken away, she arrives at the center of the sphere of her mythic wholeness, absolutely nude, and there she finds her sister, the queen of the underworld. Now this Innana taking off the 7 veils is not just the belly dance of the 7 veils. That's kind of Islamic harem comic book version. And it doesn't have much to do with the kind of crib notes that the young Mark wrote down about Mary Magdalene, who was cured of having 7 devils thrown out of her. It just means that little John Mark was only 4 years old when Jesus died. Just didn't understand what he was being told by the old curmudgeon Peter. That Mary Magdalene was a wisdom master, very much like an Innana. And that she was able to go through the 7 veils that are necessary to take off to get to the center of her interior sphere and reach perfection. That in fact it's a universal sign in antiquity for more millennia than one can realize of the perfect wisdom of a wise woman. And that Mary Magdalene was the archetypal wise woman of Hellenistic Judaism. Nothing to do with a penitent sinner. Sorry. It's going to be hard to collect money to put into religious coffers on the basis of telling these old comic book lies after a few things get straightened out. Innana, very much later like Mary Magdalene reliving and going through to perfection of that old mythic wholeness so as to take the first step into a new archetypal dimension, is exemplified in the Pistis Sophia, one of the Gnostic texts to survive from the early 2nd century A.D. Mary Magdalene could not have taken that step into a new archetypal realm, into a new aeon, unless she had fulfilled all the stages of evolution before, Innana being archetypally the stage that came exactly before her transition era. She lived in an era where things were transforming from one archetype to another, and Innana, all these myths of Innana, translated by Diane Goldstein, were written by a young woman. Innana was her name, who lived when that whole aeon, which was ending at the time of Mary Magdalene, was just beginning. When it was beginning from a yet older aeon that was ending itself. And the author of the mythology of Innana was none other than the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the first really great international king in the world. He's the one who established the Fertile Crescent from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. He linked all of that together. And the place that was at the curve of the Fertile Crescent, the city that was at the apex of the curve of that Fertile Crescent was Haran. If you read your Old Testament, Haran is where Abraham's father was in business. He was in the caravan business, running caravans from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea out of Haran. And when the Akkadian Empire, the Fertile Crescent, dissolved, one of the few things that was left was the caravan road. Which is why Abraham becomes an archetypal figure, because he is the interior perfection of that completeness that once was the Sumerian Akkadian Fertile Crescent. There are a lot of ways that ancient wisdom can be understood. And it's not just all intellectual. It all quite actually happened, and still happens in us. And until we mature and fulfill, it'll just happen over and over again. We'll replay the old scenarios with new blocks over and over again. This 5-phase energy cycle in the mythology of Innana, making the sphere of her world, which is necessary in order to find where the center of it is, begins with a tree, the hulupu tree, which later on becomes one of the trees in the Garden of Eden, the hulupu tree. And the hulupu tree causes a lot of trouble. When the mythology of Innana begins, the very first words are, if we turn to it, in the first days, in the very first days, in the first nights, in the very first nights, in the first years, in the very first years. Begins with a triad of lines. And right away, someone with a wisdom eye sees that fullness of form. When you're talking about years, you're talking about a solar cycle. Innana originally, before the mythology of Innana was complete, Innana was a lunar goddess. She was a moon goddess. Her cycles of completeness were the moons, menstrual moons. She has to learn to get in sync, to put in sync her lunar cycle with the father's masculine solar cycle. That really takes a lot of doing. And the only way to do it is to understand what is that solar cycle. Otherwise, you don't know how to integrate the lunar cycle with it. Well, what is it? One has to find out. So Innana not only goes to a center to find her sister, the queen of the underworld, at the very center of the gravity-less. You ever read the Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth? At the very center of the Earth, there's no gravity. A zero-G center. One has to go into one zero-G center within in order to find one's underworld sister twin. Real archetype. Not metaphysical, fictive, comic book stuff. Actual. Upsetting. Perilous. Because it takes everything that we have to do it. And to the extent that we withhold energy from that activity, to that extent we fail. The hulupu tree is the very first phase of the 5 phases. And at the very beginning of the first phase, It talks about the very first days, the very first nights, the very first years. The Hulupu tree is the first phase. The second phase is Innana and the god of wisdom, who is Father Enki, her father Enki. And the third phase is the courtship of Innana and Dumuzi. The fourth phase is her descent into the underworld to find her sister Ereshkigal. And the fifth phase are 7 hymns celebrating Innana. And these 5 phases are not only linked together in a linear phase form development, but those 5 phases have a complement of another, what would be a 5-phase complementary cycle. Because every time you have something that establishes itself, you have something that doesn't establish itself. This is very difficult to understand. Earlier in this century, one of the most puzzling things that came out from the mathematics of Einstein, from general relativity, finally realized was that because this is a universe that has electrons in it, it is also a universe that must have holes where the electrons are not, and they're called positrons. And the concept and discovery of the positron was one of the first wisdom lessons of modern physics. That the positron actually exists was the first great philosophic conundrum that nuclear physics had to overcome in order to understand reality. That positrons were real was an earth-shaking, perilous intellectual realization. Shook hell out of the people that first dealt with it. You mean to say that electrons cast shadows and that those shadows are real and you have to take them into mathematical computation? Yes. That's where the phrase holy shit came from. From physics labs like the Cavendish in England, where they realized that this is absolutely true. And that when you take that into consideration mathematically, your math becomes refined enough to be real. And that what you write down on paper mathematically can be turned into reality, that you can take E equals mc squared and make an atom bomb. That's where the phrase no shit came from. That's the other form, that's the other side of it. Not only that this is true, but that it works. Loud and dirty so you hear it clear. George S. Patton, courtesy of Francis Coppola. What Innana does in her 5-phase mythology is complemented by an unspoken, an unsaid anti-mythology that is a secret tradition. It's secret because no one ever says it, no one ever writes it down. What is that? It's the complementary movement to the mythology. But the complementation does not move by phases because they're holes. They don't have any phase. So the holes all just mesh together so that it's a space. It's just a singular space that has no boundary. And the only energy that will operate in a universal singular space without boundary is love. It's the only energy that works. In a boundless space of actual wholeness, H-O-L-E-N-E-S-S, the only energy that will work is love. So the undercurrent, as Innana develops her mythic sphere of wholeness, is that love learns to bridge underneath it all. It's a very curious thing. Very curious. Very curious. More next week. Please get your book of Daniel and Sir Gawain.